Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. One thing I get asked a lot about from students or people just reaching out to me online is music theory, the basics of music theory. So some people haven't really been introduced to the basics of music theory, and it's kind of a scary process or scary thought of trying to understand it and learn it for the first time, which it can be. There's many different programs out there for understanding music theory. It essentially is like learning a new language, so it can be a little intimidating at first. Or people who have a basic understanding of music theory and they may know what the modes are, or they've tried to play certain scales, but they don't know what to do with them. They don't know how it's used on the instrument. So that's what we're going to look at today, is a very practical approach to learning the basics of music theory. As you can see, I don't have a whiteboard behind me with the circle of fifths and all that kind of stuff. We're going to be doing everything on the guitar. We are going to be playing everything. Now, this is the system I use for my students to get a basic introduction into music theory so that you can understand a little bit of the language of music. If you hear musicians talk about this song's in the key of D and it's a 1-4-5, knowing what that means and not only how to play it, but also what to do with that. So you can improvise to that, or you can write your own music as well. So if you have been playing for a little bit, you know some songs, you know some chords, but you want to have a better understanding of music, how it's built, why certain things go together better than others, and ways of describing what you're doing. That's what we're going to be looking at today. It can definitely be a little intimidating at first to get started in music theory. I remember when I was young, maybe around the age of 11 or 12, I was playing for a little bit. I wanted to better understand the language of music, and I said to my teacher, who was a classical guitar teacher at the time, what does it mean to play in a key? I keep hearing people say the song's in the key of E. What does that mean? And I still remember him handing me a book about maybe 400 or 500 pages thick saying, read that and that will explain it. And at the age of 11 or 12, or pretty much any age, you're like, no thanks, I'm okay. Ignore the question. But then I ended up having another teacher a couple years later asking the same sort of question. What does it mean to play in a key? And he showed a pretty similar approach to what I do with my students now. And it made so much more sense. It was so less intimidating and got me playing the stuff on the fretboard right away. So in today's video, we're going to learn the major scale and all about intervals. We're going to start with the C major scale. It's a nice scale to start with because there's no sharps and flats in the C major scale. So it's just C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Now we're going to use this position that I just played. There are different ways of playing a C major scale. You can play it many different ways on the fretboard, but for the way we're going to be approaching the scale, I find this is the best position to use. So similar to something like bar chords, on the guitar, once you learn one scale, you kind of know them all. And what I mean by that is we just played a C major scale starting at the 3rd fret of the A string because that first note is C. And then we played a major scale pattern. Now, if I want to play D major, I can just shift that whole thing up to D starting at the 5th fret. And it's going to be the D major scale, or E major, F major. Hopefully you can see I'm using the exact same shape, I'm just starting it from different notes. So playing one major scale is not really any harder than another major scale. So now we're going to get into intervals. What are intervals? Intervals are just a name given to describe the distance between two notes. So if I start with this note, which is our C, and then I play another note, there's a name to describe the distance between those two notes. Now in this case, it's the 5th note of our major scale. And you can see it's kind of my power chord shape here. And that's why a power chord is called a 5 chord. It's because you're playing the 1 and the 5. So again, with intervals, similar to our scale, I can move that up to a different position on the fretboard, and it's two completely different notes, but the interval is still the same because the distance between those two notes hasn't changed. So the easy part with intervals is in our major scale, all the notes are just numbered. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the 8th note is you're back to the root note. So if you start with C, your 8th note is going to be another C. So the easy part is they're all just numbered. Then the slightly harder part is that you can have different types of intervals. So in the major scale, you would have your first note, which can be called the root note, the tonic, perfect first. There's a bunch of different names for the first note of the scale, but you're not really going to be changing the first note of the scale just because that's your root, that's where you're starting from. But you can be changing all the other notes. So we have our perfect first, root. We have a major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and then your octave or your perfect eighth. Now the difference between a major interval and a minor interval is just flattening it by a half step. So if I have a major second here, second note of our major scale, if I want to play a minor second, I just play one fret lower, and that would be a minor second. If I have a major third, so just working up to the third note of the scale, and I want to play a minor third, it's just one fret back. And you can hear they have different tones to them. They sound completely different. If I play a major sixth versus a minor sixth, very different sound. If you're writing music, those two things are night and day. So those are the different types of intervals. And then with the fourth and fifth note, that's also where you will hear terms like diminished and augmented. Those are kind of a fancy musical term for flattened or sharp. So if you were to take a fifth note and sharp it, you could call that augmented fifth. Or if you flattened it, that would be a diminished fifth. So you can practice playing all different types of intervals based off of your root note and hear how they sound. They all sound completely different. You have to remember that it is the distance between two notes. So you'd have to play your root note and then the other note. If I just play this note, that's not really an interval because you're not hearing it relate to another note. So now that we've covered intervals, in part 2, we're going to be looking at the modes of the major scale, and we're going to be using our intervals to learn them.